She asked me to stay after class, and one conversation changed everything. The classroom was quiet after the last bell. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, painting long, golden rectangles across the floor, dust motes dancing lazily in the warmth. My backpack rested by the side of my chair, and I hesitated for a moment, listening to the faint echo of footsteps and the soft shuffle of papers as the few remaining students trickled out. Then there was only us. "Stay after class," she had said. "We need to talk." Her voice, calm but with a subtle weight behind it, still lingered in my mind. I swallowed, feeling a mix of curiosity and nervousness that made my chest tighten. Slowly, I gathered my notebook and walked toward her desk. Each step felt deliberate, as if I were entering a space that had always been hers, yet now it was shared, even if just for a few minutes. She looked up as I approached, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met mine. The way she held my gaze was not intimidating, rather, it was quietly observant, like she was noticing more than I could see myself. She was impeccably composed, as always, with her dark hair pulled back in a loose, effortless style that framed her face. The soft glow of the afternoon light highlighted the warmth in her eyes, and I realized I could no longer call this mere admiration, there was something more, something I hadn't yet named. As she arranged the papers on her desk, I noticed the small, human gestures she often hid behind her professional demeanor, the slight tilt of her head when she read a title, the way she smoothed her blouse over her shoulder. There was a grace to her movements, a quiet rhythm that drew me in. And then there was the subtle scent, barely there but unmistakable, warm vanilla with a hint of cedarwood. It was faint, yet it lingered in the air around her, wrapping the space with an invisible familiarity that I didn't realize I craved. I cleared my throat, unsure of what to say. My notebook felt heavier in my hands than it had all day, as if it carried the weight of the moment itself. She glanced up again, her gaze softening, and gave the smallest of nods, encouraging me without words. There was patience in her presence, a calm steadiness that contrasted with the rapid thrum of my own heartbeat. I moved closer to the desk, noticing the sunlight glinting off the polished wood, the faint hum of the radiator in the corner, the subtle creak of the chair as I shifted my weight. Every sound, every tiny motion, felt amplified, as if the classroom had become a private stage for a single, fragile interaction. And then, almost imperceptibly, she offered me a smile. Not the formal, polite kind reserved for students, but a quiet, curious smile, as though she were letting me glimpse a piece of her inner world. My chest tightened again, not with anxiety, but with the strange, thrilling awareness that this was no ordinary conversation. The air between us felt charged in the softest way, filled with unspoken possibilities. I didn't know yet what we were about to talk about, or how much it would matter. But in that quiet classroom, bathed in sunlight and dust, I realized that staying behind was no longer just an obligation, it was an invitation. And I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. After a moment of silence, she finally looked up fully, letting her eyes meet mine again. There was no rush, no expectation, only a gentle, steady patience that made the classroom feel softer somehow. I set my notebook on her desk, the faint scrape of paper against wood loud in the quiet room. "So," she began, her voice calm, "about your essay." She flipped through the pages with careful attention, and I noticed the subtle precision in her movements. Her fingers brushed the corners of the paper lightly, almost reverently, and I realized I was watching more than just her hands, I was watching her focus, the way her mind worked, the quiet confidence in the rhythm of her gestures. I swallowed and nodded. "I tried to follow your feedback from last time." My voice sounded louder than I intended, but she only smiled, a small, approving curl of her lips. "You did," she said softly. "You improved on a lot of points." There was a pause, natural and unforced, and then she tilted her head slightly, her dark hair catching the sunlight and casting faint shadows across her cheek. "Do you like the topic?" she asked. "Not just the essay, but the topic itself." Her curiosity seemed genuine, the kind that invited honesty. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "I think so. I mean, I never thought about it that way before." It made me notice things I wouldn't have otherwise. Her lips curved into a thoughtful smile. That's good. Learning isn't just about following instructions, it's about noticing, exploring, connecting ideas to your own experiences. She leaned back slightly in her chair, the light brushing against her face, and for a moment, her expression softened, almost intimate, though it carried the quiet restraint of someone careful with boundaries. We drifted into small talk, moving effortlessly from the essay to books she recommended, to music she mentioned in passing during lectures. I found myself leaning slightly closer, just enough to hear her clearly, feeling the warmth radiating from her presence. She laughed softly at one of my comments, and the sound was light, like sunlight bouncing off the walls, filling the space with ease. My chest felt that familiar tightening, a mix of admiration, fascination, and something tender I couldn't quite name. At one point, she reached across the desk to adjust a stray strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek. Her hand brushed mine for the briefest instant, and the warmth lingered, not bold or intrusive, just enough to make my heart skip. I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume again, warm vanilla and cedarwood, and the soft rustle of her blouse as she moved. My fingers itched to linger, but I stayed still, aware of the quiet tension that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. We shared a few more moments of conversation, the kind that felt ordinary but, under the sunlight and quiet hum of the empty classroom, was extraordinary. The connection wasn't declared, it was observed, felt, and internalized. Her eyes, her expressions, the subtle cues in her posture, they all spoke to something unspoken between us, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us had yet named. By the time I finally looked up from my notebook, I realized the air felt warmer, the room smaller, as if the universe had contracted to hold just the two of us. And though the conversation was simple, everyday small talk, I sensed it carried more weight than any lecture, any assignment. In that moment, I understood the power of presence, and how quietly, effortlessly, she had drawn me closer without ever asking. The sunlight had shifted slightly by the time we settled into the quiet rhythm of conversation. Papers were stacked, pens set aside, and for a moment the room seemed to exist only for us, suspended in an almost fragile calm. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her notebook, and I sensed a hesitation I hadn't noticed before. Her poised exterior softened, revealing a subtle tension that wasn't part of her usual confident demeanor. "I'll be honest," she began, her voice low, almost confiding, "sometimes I feel overwhelmed. Not by the work itself, but by the responsibility. The pressure to always be composed, to always have the answers." Her words were careful, deliberate, but there was a vulnerability there, a quiet admission that she didn't often share with anyone. I listened intently, my chest tightening, not from surprise, but from the intimacy of being trusted with this side of her. There was something magnetic about her honesty, something that demanded attention without forcing it. I didn't know," I said softly, unsure how to respond. My voice carried the weight of sincerity, the sort that can't be rehearsed. She gave a faint, almost shy smile, and I noticed how her eyes softened, the corners crinkling slightly. "Most people don't see it," she admitted. "They see the teacher, the professional, the confident exterior. Rarely anyone sees the rest of it. The doubts, the quiet fears." Her hand rested on the desk, fingers curled loosely, and I realized I wanted to reach out, to offer reassurance, though I wasn't sure how. For a moment, the room held only our shared presence. I shifted slightly in my chair, aware of the subtle closeness between us, the warmth of sunlight catching her cheekbones, the soft cadence of her breathing. "It's human," I said gently. "Everyone has doubts. Even the people who seem the most composed." Her gaze lingered on me, and I noticed the faint flicker of relief in her eyes, the sense that being heard mattered more than any professional accolade. "Thank you," she murmured, almost to herself. "It feels strange to admit it out loud." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged with a quiet connection. I could feel the subtle tension in the space between us, not of desire, but of trust, of emotional intimacy slowly knitting itself into the moment. Her vulnerability had created a bridge, a delicate line of understanding that made my own walls soften in response. She shifted slightly, resting her hands on the edge of the desk, and I noticed the small, human gestures that made her so compelling, the gentle arch of her fingers, the tilt of her head as she considered her words, the quiet weight of her presence in the sunlit room. I wanted to stay in this suspended moment, to simply exist here with her, without needing to say more than what our eyes and posture had already conveyed. "I appreciate you, listening," she said finally, her voice warmer now, lighter. It wasn't just a polite acknowledgement, it carried the unspoken sense that she had allowed herself to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in this space. And in that moment, I realized that our connection had deepened beyond casual conversation or academic discussion. Something fragile, careful, and immensely human had begun to grow, a trust and intimacy that neither of us had rushed toward, yet neither could deny. The conversation had settled into a quiet rhythm after her confession, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of understanding, of unspoken recognition, of shared presence. I sat across from her, aware of every subtle movement, the soft brush of her fingers against the edge of a notebook, the way sunlight highlighted the curve of her cheek, the slight rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Then it happened. Almost without thinking, she reached across the desk, her hand lightly brushing my sleeve as she adjusted it. It was such a small gesture, so easily explained away, and yet the warmth of her fingers lingered on my arm far longer than the physical touch itself. A subtle thrill ran through me, not a shock, not a desire, but a sense of connection that resonated in the quiet of the room. "Careful with that corner," she said softly, straightening a folded sheet of paper that had slipped from my notebook. Her voice was gentle, with that same warmth that had made the previous moments feel intimate without effort. I looked down at her hand, the faint pressure of her touch still felt like a spark against my skin. For a moment it was just us and that soft contact, a bridge between our worlds that neither words nor assignments could create. I cleared my throat, suddenly self-conscious, but she didn't withdraw. Instead, she kept her hand near mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if she, too, were aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, framing her face in golden tones, and I felt the urge to stay in that moment forever, just close enough to notice the warmth of her presence without overstepping. Our eyes met, and in that glance, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. The age difference, the professional boundaries, the quiet rules of decorum, all of it lingered in the space between us. Yet this touch, so fleeting and yet so significant, carried a meaning beyond words. It was trust. It was recognition. It was the first step toward something neither of us could name aloud yet. She withdrew her hand gracefully, but I noticed how she lingered just a second longer than needed, adjusting her papers with a softness that felt intentional. I found myself exhaling slowly, my heart still slightly accelerated, aware that this tiny, seemingly mundane touch had shifted the dynamic between us. The tension was subtle, not urgent or desperate, but a quiet awareness that something new had begun to form, something delicate, meaningful, and entirely unsaid. The classroom felt warmer somehow, as if her proximity had infused the air with a gentle energy. The soft hum of the radiator, the rustle of papers, the distant chirping of birds outside, all became part of this shared, suspended moment. My hands rested on the desk, still tingling from her touch, and I realized that physical contact, even brief and innocent, carried a resonance that words alone could never convey. For the first time, I understood that closeness could be more than just conversation. It could be a glance, a touch, a shared awareness of each other's presence. And in that quiet, sunlit classroom, her fingers brushing mine had spoken louder than anything either of us could have said. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing: the first touch had changed everything. The classroom had grown quieter still, the golden afternoon sunlight stretching longer shadows across the floor. After that brief, meaningful touch, something had shifted subtly between us, a delicate tension that neither of us tried to name. It wasn't urgency or bold desire, it was awareness, a gentle pull that drew attention to the smallest gestures, the briefest looks, and the unspoken possibilities hovering in the air. I found myself watching her as she adjusted the papers on her desk, her fingers moving with the same quiet grace I had noticed from the beginning. But now, each motion carried a new weight. Every tilt of her head, every fleeting glance toward me, felt like a signal I wasn't sure how to interpret. My chest tightened slightly with anticipation and uncertainty, the kind of feeling that makes one acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Her eyes met mine, and we held the look just a moment too long. Not a stare, not an intrusion, simply a lingering acknowledgement. I felt an electric hum in that shared gaze, subtle and restrained, as though we were testing the boundaries of what was acceptable and what could remain unspoken. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, a hint of warmth that sent a jolt through me. And yet, immediately, she looked away, her fingers brushing against her notebook as though that had been the most natural thing in the world. Internally, my mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Was it just my imagination? Was I reading too much into her gestures? But the warmth of that first touch, the depth of her earlier vulnerability, and now the soft, lingering glances made it impossible to ignore the subtle pull between us. I wanted to reach out, to speak, to bridge the gap, yet some part of me hesitated, aware of the age difference, of her role as a teacher, of the fragile line between propriety and something more. I caught myself mirroring her posture without realizing it, leaning slightly forward when she leaned in, adjusting my hands on the desk in the same rhythm she adjusted hers. It was a silent conversation of body language, a tentative exploration of proximity without words. Each glance, each movement, became loaded with meaning, and yet the tension remained polite, restrained, and achingly human. She noticed, of course. There was a flicker in her eyes when our movements synchronized for a brief moment, a quiet acknowledgement that neither of us needed to voice. And in that flicker, I saw her own internal struggle, the awareness of boundaries, the careful balance between professionalism and the undeniable emotional connection forming between us. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might speak, but then she smiled again and returned her attention to the papers, letting the unspoken tension remain suspended in the sunlit room. The more we lingered in that quiet space, the more aware I became of how our proximity affected me. The warmth of her presence, the subtle scent of her perfume, the soft cadence of her voice, all of it resonated in my chest, a mixture of admiration, fascination, and yearning restrained by caution. By the time I looked away, focusing on my notebook to hide my awareness of our shared tension, I realized something undeniable. We were both consciously aware of the connection, each glance a dialogue, each pause a question. And though nothing had been said aloud, the emotional stakes had never felt higher. In that moment, the room was not just a classroom, it was a space where boundaries, desire, and trust intertwined delicately, leaving us both on the edge of something neither of us dared to define. The sky outside had darkened slightly, clouds drifting in to soften the afternoon light. A sudden patter of rain began against the windows, and the classroom seemed to shrink around us, cocooned in its warm, quiet bubble. The sound of droplets hitting the glass added a rhythmic heartbeat to the space, almost like a drum keeping time with our own unspoken tension. She glanced toward the window, a fleeting shadow of surprise crossing her face, and I instinctively moved a step closer to help her stack a few loose papers that had begun to flutter in the breeze from the slightly open window. Our hands brushed as we both reached for the same sheet. It was accidental, yet deliberate in the way these small moments often are, the universe arranging the moment with quiet precision. A warmth spread through my arm from that brief contact, a soft reminder of the connection that had been growing between us. Her eyes met mine, wide and honest, and she gave the tiniest tilt of her head, a subtle, vulnerable gesture that made my chest tighten. The rain's gentle rhythm created a private symphony for us, one that seemed to hush the world outside and magnify the smallest sensations. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the subtle scent of her perfume blending with the fresh, rain-scented air drifting in through the open window. It was a moment charged with quiet intensity, the kind that lingered in the chest long after it passed. We shared a laugh over the papers, a soft, genuine sound that felt intimate, unhurried. It was different from the small smiles of earlier, it carried an undertone of ease, comfort, and unspoken mutual understanding. Her presence felt larger than the classroom, enveloping me in a quiet reassurance, and I realized that this was more than mere admiration or curiosity. The emotional tension between us had reached its peak, yet it was gentle, respectful, and profoundly human. For a brief instant, time seemed to pause. Our hands, once separated, hovered near each other, fingers almost touching. I felt a tug of hesitation. Part of me wanted to close the distance, to let the warmth of the touch linger, but restraint held me back, honoring the boundaries that had always existed. She seemed to sense the tension, her breath catching just slightly, and there was a silent acknowledgement of what was possible and what must remain unspoken. I noticed the subtle movements around us, the soft rustle of her blouse as she shifted, the faint tap of her fingernail against the desk, the shimmer of sunlight refracted through rain-speckled windows. Each sound, each motion, was amplified in the quiet intimacy of the room, reminding me that connection didn't need words to be profoundly felt. Finally, she leaned back slightly, her gaze lingering on me with a mixture of curiosity, warmth, and something tender I wasn't yet ready to name. I exhaled slowly, acutely aware of the shared silence, the unspoken understanding, and the way our presence alone had created an emotional closeness that neither of us could ignore. By the time the rain softened, and the classroom returned to its usual ambient hum, I knew something had changed. This wasn't a fleeting encounter, it was a shared moment that would linger in memory, a subtle, tender bridge between two hearts navigating uncharted territory. And though nothing had been spoken aloud, the emotional peak had arrived, leaving us both aware of the depth of connection simmering beneath our restraint. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle by the time the bells signaled the end of the day. The classroom, once filled with the quiet energy of anticipation, now felt calm, almost sacred, as though it had held its breath just for us. I gathered my notebook and backpack slowly, aware that the moment we'd shared, the fleeting brush of hands, the lingering glances, the quiet intimacy of conversation, had changed everything. She looked up at me, her dark eyes soft and attentive, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. There was no need for words to acknowledge what had passed between us, it was written in the subtle warmth of her expression, in the gentle steadiness of her gaze. The air between us was charged, not with urgency, but with the quiet recognition of a connection that was both delicate and profound. "Thank you for staying behind," she said, her voice calm but infused with a warmth that made my chest tighten. I appreciate your patience, your thoughtfulness." Her words were simple, yet they carried weight, the acknowledgement of the bond that had quietly formed, the trust that had been carefully built. I nodded, feeling a rush of emotions I couldn't entirely name. "I should be the one thanking you," I murmured. "For sharing that with me. For trusting me." My fingers brushed the strap of my backpack, a nervous gesture, and yet I felt an unspoken comfort in her presence. She noticed, of course, her gaze softening with subtle amusement and kindness. She rose from behind the desk, moving with her usual graceful poise, yet there was a gentleness in the way she approached me as if to bridge the invisible space that had always defined our roles. "Keep up your work," she said softly, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. The touch was fleeting, almost ceremonial, but it resonated deeper than words. It was affirmation, connection, and encouragement all at once. The warmth of her hand lingered in my mind long after it had withdrawn. I took a step toward the door, feeling the quiet weight of the moment pressing in. Our eyes met one last time before I turned, and I caught the faint glimmer of something tender, something unsaid, that promised this was not the end. There was hope there, quiet but undeniable, a possibility that this connection, delicate and slow-burning, might continue to grow outside the confines of the classroom. The hallway beyond was brighter, filled with the chatter and movement of other students returning to their routines. Yet I carried the quiet intimacy of our shared moments with me, tucked carefully in my chest, a warmth that followed each step. The memory of her smile, her trust, the subtle touches, and the lingering glances became a private solace, a thread of connection I could return to whenever I needed to feel grounded. As I stepped outside, the drizzle kissing my skin, I looked back once, almost instinctively. She was at her desk, straightening papers, bathed in the soft afternoon light that filtered through the rain-streaked windows. Our eyes met briefly again, and I saw her lips curl into that small, knowing smile, an acknowledgement that our story had begun, quietly, gently, without haste, and without the need for urgency. And in that moment, I understood the essence of slow-burn connection. It wasn't the dramatic confessions or grand gestures that mattered most, it was the shared presence, the trust, the warmth, and the unspoken understanding that two hearts could meet across age, boundaries, and circumstance. The door closed behind me, but the feeling lingered, soft, tender, and full of promise.